Policy of America's Society and the Council of the Americas, and the editor-in-chief of America's Quarterly. In the latest issue of America's Quarterly, we asked the question on our cover, guess who's having a good pandemic? And the answer was organized crime. And on the cover, and I know it's kind of a dark image and you probably can't see it, but we had a member of a gang in Central America, of an organized crime group, standing under a street light holding a gun. And these gangs, such as MS-13, the PCC, which is based in Brazil, the Sinaloa cartel, which is based in Mexico, groups like the ELN in Colombia and elsewhere, everything indicates that they're having, as the cover says, a good pandemic because governments are distracted, somewhat understandably, by the pandemic. They have other priorities. And as a result, these groups are expanding their operations and recruitment and moving into segments of the economy and trade and criminality where they were not present before. But, you know, the truth is we could have just as easily put a maker of counterfeit or pirated goods on this cover. We know that the last year has seen an increase in illicit and pirated goods, everything from fake N95 masks to fake COVID vaccines, alcohol, cigarettes, and more. In fact, listen to this. Interpol found that counterfeiting and piracy is actually one of the fastest growing segments of transnational crime internationally, with revenues estimated to be even higher than drug trade and human trafficking. By another estimate, illicit trade cost the world over $2.2 trillion in 2020. And, you know, oftentimes these are the same groups, gangs like the PCC, that are deeply involved in the trade of these goods. And the picture that emerges is of clear risk to rule of law and to these economies all over the Americas, and indeed all over the world, as we try to recover from the pandemic. So at today's event today, we want to ask some really key questions. How is COVID-19 changing the nature of illicit trade? What are the risks at a time when governments are desperate for revenue and resources that come, of course, from taxes when goods are, when there's legal commerce? And finally, how can illicit trade best be curbed at a time when authorities have so many other priorities? We have a great panel to try to answer some of these questions today. Angélica Durán-Martínez is an associate professor of political science at the University of Massachusetts at Lowell. Fernando Vieira is the director of external affairs at Philip Morris Brazil. And Maurício Vieira is the chair on combating and preventing illicit trade and transnational organized crime at the University for Peace. We would like to thank Philip Morris International, who is sponsoring this event on this important topic today. I've asked our panelists to please keep their answers short. I think we've all found over the last 13 months or so in this digital space that the best events are the ones that resemble a conversation among knowledgeable friends rather than a series of monologues. So let's get to it. You know, this just sort of basic question to kick things off. What changes have you seen in the nature of illicit trade since the pandemic started some 13 months ago? And I'd like to start first with Fernando. Fernando, good morning.
Good morning, Brian. I'd like to thank you and to say hi to everybody listening to us and to the other panelists. And thank you to having the opportunity of to say our words here on our opinion in the name of the private sector. And I think that, Brian, to be straight to the point, to the questions that you raised and start the debate, I see the question you raised through two directions. You know, the first one, I would say that, you know, it's very clear to see in these pandemic times that the illicit trade is always going to find its way. No matter the scenario, no matter the crisis, no matter how serious the background is, and the pandemic is, and the situation is, we are going to see, and we saw in many countries, and I'm saying with the reality here of Brazil, we've seen all types of problems related to illicit trade in different elements. You see people counterfeiting or companies counterfeiting hand sanitizers to medical equipment to, taking advantage of every little gap in the chain. Even in times of pandemic where you have millions and millions of people dying. So there's no way that illicit trade, we're not going to find a space to operate. And now with the fragility of the capacity of the government to face all this, it's really the complication of this is really getting even higher. And the other aspect that we see, especially in developing countries, Brian, is, of course, we have an explosion of e-commerce, and it's especially in developing countries. And it's a positive side when you see the economy moving a little bit, being forced to move in a digital way. You see it's positive. But on the other hand, you see companies being, more dependent on the e-commerce side. And also illicit trade goes together on this wave, leveraging on this mechanism as well, even more. And you having, each time more, they leverage on this tool and finding their space even more in these new tools, electronic tools. You can have, for instance, the information that in Brazil, for instance, this e-commerce has increased almost 70% versus last year. And that's also an arena where illicit trade is playing a lot. And also we have to increase our ways of control this. Otherwise, it's going to become even more complicated to face this issue in the future. So that's basically the dynamics that I think that is more visible here from the perspective of the private sector.
All right, thank you, Fernando. Angélica, I'd like to take it to you. I mean, Fernando gave us a good overview there and talked about, in response to what's new, talked a lot about the expanding e-commerce segment, which is a story that we hear just everywhere, not just about the expansion of e-commerce, but the risks and the expansion in piracy within that segment. Perhaps you could comment on that a bit, but also give us a general overview for how you think things have changed over the last 12 months or so.
That was me, right? Yeah. So thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure for me to be here today and in such great company. So I will say, of course, the pandemic, I think we have all experienced in a way that we never experienced before, something that has completely upended our lives and changed everything. So it will be silly not to think that this will change radically and produce major changes in the dynamics of illicit trade and the dynamics of organized crime. At the same time, I think it's important to recognize what's new and what's not so new and what's just another way of adaptation that we have seen, and that's the nature of illicit trade and is the nature of the groups involved in it. So I think, as Fernando was saying, and in your introduction, Brian, of course, we see some newer things that are related with the expansion of e-commerce and the expansion of cybercrime. Like we have seen like news and reports about scams becoming more common, like apps that have been used to try to get people in Latin America to sign onto those apps with and with information that is not true about the pandemic, and then try to get their information. Of course, we have also, I think, a newer set of piracy forms related to medical supplies and to things that were crucial during the pandemic. And those are, I think, what are the more newer markets that we may see emerging here. But then we have all the older ones and the things where what we may have seen an expansion. So I will say that there are maybe three things that are coming from the pandemic that are not entirely new, as I said, and that I think are gonna, in the end, impact the most the areas that were already severely impacted by organized crime. But we see, of course, a tendency maybe towards diversification in criminal portfolios. Again, this is not entirely new. I think the areas where we see more diversification is places where there was already diversification in criminal portfolios. But I think, and I don't think all the organizations are capable of adapting. So we have lower level groups and lower level criminal organizations or criminal groups that may adapt onto certain activities that they have the capability of doing so, like more extortion or new extortion markets, but may not actually have the ability or the knowledge to engage into this cybercrime. So I think the adaptation also depends on who we're talking about, and maybe later we can get more into the different types of organizations that we see. But we see this, we see a diversification, we may see an adaptation also again. Eventually there may be a survival of the fittest, with some of the strongest organizations being able to adapt better to a pandemic changes. But then also we are seeing more fragmentation. And again, I think this is maybe a tendency that was existing before, but we are seeing it, like at least in this short term, we're seeing diversification and fragmentation of the groups engaged in criminal activities. I will also highlight that things change over time. So at the very beginning, I don't think it was clear that all the groups were benefiting right away from the pandemic. So most groups had to deal with disruptions in supply chain. Groups that were more dependent on extortion, like the gangs in Central America, they had a limitation because of, and there were different adaptations there. So initially, I don't think all the groups, and in Colombia, for example, there were groups that ended up enforcing lockdowns because they were truly afraid of getting COVID and then eventually having to go to hospitals where they could be arrested. So I think the initial impact was also not one of absolute success for everybody. This is something that happened over time, and I think has to do again with the ability of groups to adapt. Not all of them do it successfully. And just to close my comments and hopefully maybe come back to this later, I think that when we talk about the impacts of the pandemic and on organized crime, it's crucial to think about the public security forces and what they mean. I don't think to some extent it's true that they are not prepared. It's true that they don't have the ability to cope with the challenge. But I think, and the way that I have understood organized crime since I started researching this, is that we cannot understand it unless we understand the ways in which the state, by tolerating or confronting groups, also contributes to this. So I think there is a big story of corruption that goes beyond illicit groups that is important to keep in mind.
Thank you, Angélica. Yes, I'd like to come back specifically to that question of security forces and the state. But before we do, I want to ask Maurício to give you the opportunity to ask the same, or to answer the same initial question I've posed, but also please feel free to maybe take a slightly more specific take on this, which is, what do you see region-wide as kind of the biggest hotspots for illicit trade right now over the last year or so? And what, in your mind, makes these countries more vulnerable?
Thank you, Brian. Good morning to everyone. Good morning, Angélica, Fernando, and thank you, American Society, for organizing this event. Before answering this question, I would like just to make one comment that COVID-19 is not only a health crisis, but in a sense, it is a crisis that causes a disruptive in social, economic, and political structures. And I think that the illicit trade, for example, criminal organizations find a way in this disruptive dynamic in a way that they improve their own practices. But regarding to your question, what makes, for example, these countries, areas more vulnerable? I think that Fernando mentioned one important aspect for this context that is related to state fragility. And for state fragility, we consider that institutions should play a prominent role in providing not only information, but at the same time, the political goods, such as human security policies that could protect the citizens from this pandemic and as well from this vulnerable activity and threatened activity that pose criminal organizations. And the reason why these countries are vulnerable relates to the fact that they present a high level of social and economic inequalities, and in some of them, unprecedented levels of state corruption and political involvement with organized crime. And I think that Angélica is totally correct when she mentions about linking the perspective on corruption to understanding this dynamic. In addition, I think that the vulnerability in these countries or areas is related to the lack of the state in provide political goods to its inhabitants. And I would say, for example, organized criminal groups occupy the space the state left empty, in a sense that these groups are claiming their power over a territory and an illicit activity. Thank you.
But I do want to follow up and just press you a little bit on this, and our other panelists can feel free to jump in and sort of give their own view. But within the Latin American context, are there countries or regions where you see these conditions being most acute and therefore illicit trade having sort of surged the most and become more of an issue over the last 12 months or so?
Well, Brian, I presume that my answer goes directly to identify, for example, these hotspots that I already know. For example, countries in Northern Triangle, countries in Triple Border, and countries that do not belong to any of these regions, such as Colombia, Bolivia, Venezuela. But I think also that we could consider small villages where criminal organizations, criminal groups also finds the way, in a sense that they want to spread the illicit activity in places that is not totally secure from the government. For example, if during these pandemic times, we can also identify a high level of control in the border. And I think that this policy, the state policy, also moved the dynamic of criminal activity to places where the border is still fragile. And I think that different other villages are presenting an unprecedented level of challenges that also relate, for example, a good example that was presented by American Quarterly, that was the situation in Tumaco in Colombia, that I think that other types of activities and recruiting youth to join these criminal organizations is one challenge that presents to us as a consequence of this criminal activity. And I think that our focus should not be only the big cities, but also small cities, small villages, not only located in the border region, but also located in the countryside.
So these are all, what I'm hearing is these are all areas where the state is weak, and in some cases, like rural Colombia being a classic example, just either not present or barely present. And some of the areas that you cited are, I think it's fair to say, some of the usual suspects when we tend to talk about these issues. My question for Angélica and Fernando is to build, if you like, on what Maurício said. And are there any kind of trouble areas, given that framework that he just spelled out, that might surprise us? Because some of these spots, like Northern Triangle, for example, it's to be expected, I suppose, that we would see some of these problems. But are there any geographical areas or segments that are on your radar that have been a surprise over the last 13 months?
So I will just kind of building up a little bit on what Maurício was saying. I do so far I haven't seen any spot or any place where I can say this is completely new, and this is not a place that surprises me in any way. We have seen some reports in Central America of certain places that may not seem to have been as active before for drug trafficking flows becoming more active, for example, in terms of land routes. We have seen some reports of, like some rural areas, as Maurício was saying, that may not have been active recently and may have become recently, but whether they are a surprise, I don't think so. And I agree with you. So I think we have two types of places and two types of ways in which we can think about the state presence in areas where organized crime is strong. We have, of course, rural areas where we literally have the state being very weak in all aspects, right? But I actually think that there are many places where the state is very much present. It may be weak, it may be corrupt, but it's generally very present through militarized forces, militarized policing. Colombia is an example of that. Mexico is an example of that. So that sometimes I think that we cannot just assume that the state is not there at all. It may not be there in the way we want it to be, but it may be. And sometimes the state responses when they come in are just a form of very strong state presence, which is militarized policing, but not necessarily other forms. And just one thing about what Maurício mentioned about recruitment, where I think we may see more of the rural areas becoming more vulnerable, as Maurício was saying, and I think there have been many reports of this in Colombia, also given the history of Colombia's conflict, which is rural areas that had very difficult access to the internet and where students really had a lot of difficulty, and it was almost impossible for them to do like high quality schooling remotely. Those areas, they became much more vulnerable for recruitment, and sometimes it's not even forced recruitment; it's they don't have anything else to do, right? So I do think that that's one side story that has to do with just the expansion of illicit markets, but it's also the expansion of the vulnerabilities and the socioeconomic vulnerabilities. That again, I don't think is new areas. We're seeing. I think the worst part of the pandemic is not creating new inequalities, is strengthening and deepening the existing ones.
Well, the story that Maurício mentioned in America's Quarterly was out of Tumaco in Colombia, was about just that, was about students who have been essentially forced out of school because they don't have the internet connection. Therefore, there's been a recruitment boom for many of these gangs. And again, I as I said in my opening statements, we think of these first as being organized crime being involved in the sale of narcotics in the region. And in most cases, that's the case, but they've just diversified and moved into so many of these other segments in recent years. Fernando, let me come back to you. And we're 20 minutes in, so we're a third of the way in. I think we've done kind of a good diagnosis. I think it would be great now to maybe shift a bit and start talking about potential solutions. What do you think, coming at this from the perspective of the private sector on this panel, what do you think the role of the private sector is in combating illicit trade in the region? How can it work better with the public sector? What do you see as the way forward on this? Because as we've kind of pointed out, these issues, they've changed, they're evolving, but they're not new. These have been stubborn problems for a long time now. So what can be done to really sort of make a difference now?
Yeah, absolutely, Brian. This is, just like you said, this is not new. And the challenge is not new, but it's extremely challenging now, especially now at the COVID time, to consider this and to come to the table and to understand and to say and to convince the governments that this continues to be and needs to be a top priority for the governments, especially at the COVID times where the priority of the government has been very different, has been, taking care of everything that the pandemic demands on, et cetera. Also the companies, but the matter is still a little bit of the same. I mean, the solution comes of taking this matter as a priority, of trying to build on collaboration, especially from the public and the private sectors. The private sector has the interest, has the legitimate interest, has the resources, has the intelligence, and has the public sector has the interest of the society in order to curb this. I think that those partnerships needs to be leveraged. It needs to be, we need to be. It's not about. It's about bringing intelligence to the table, renewing partnerships between entities in the private sector, renewing intelligence, renewing cooperation, renewing training of the authorities and these kind of programs. The initiative sector helping the government to fill in the spaces where the government has more difficult to reach, especially in those times. There are programs that we've been, for instance, at PMI. There's a big program called PMI Impact that we've been. There's been a couple of years that is going on now, where it's been forming partnership with 30 different countries, and in Brazil, for instance, we have two institutions running programs now, educational programs where more than 2 1.5 thousand of agents has been trained in Paraguay, Argentina, and Brazil. It's a matter of training. It's a matter of, kind of working together to give, to fill in the spaces where the government cannot, or sometimes is not really the priority, that joint forces can work better. And sometimes, Brian, it's not even, it's not really a lot of sophisticated things. It's just simple things. I can give you an example of when I was discussing with authorities in the border of Brazil. Brazil has a huge border and, a large community of cities, several cities in the border where they live based on contraband. The people doesn't have other economic activity in the border rather than, selling and buying things and transporting things from Paraguay to Brazil and this kind of stuff. And I was discussing with authorities, and they was saying that I was asking, how we as a private sector could help. And we were expecting that they will ask for very sophisticated things. And they came to us and said, hey, can you help us in communicating to the people and explaining to the people and putting outdoors in the city, just telling that this is against the law, just telling that this is not, normal. This is not allowed. This is something that cannot be done because it's so embedded in the life of the people that, we just think that sometimes we think that much sophisticated things. But, the government, they will need 2-3 months to, I don't know, maybe even more, to place a billboard in the city with the messages that they want because of the bureaucracy of the state, things that the private sector could do in 1 week. So this kind of cooperation, I'm putting to the simplest thing to the highest, more sophisticated thing, which is the program to have. I think that this sort of cooperation needs to be reinforced, and I'm not underestimating or underestimating the challenge of this, especially now in the times of pandemic, where the attention of the government has been really complicated to this. But it's still prioritization, resilience, and collaboration. There's still those 3 magic words.
No, thank you for that. Let me take a version of this question to Angélica and Maurício and Fernando. If you want to jump in as well, please do. Fernando, in your comments just there, you captured what I think is one of the really difficult challenges of this topic, which is we all know how important it is, and we all know how costly it is to economies. At the same time, this is a moment where governments are focused on the rollout of vaccines. Many governments in the region, are at capacity or beyond with ICUs and hospitals. They're dealing with a historic rise in unemployment in many countries. And I imagine that the temptation of many governments to just sort of say, I think, yes, this is important, but maybe we leave this for 2022, especially as you referenced in Fernando. I mean, in places like the Triple Border, this illicit trade is a source, and in some places, the main source of informal employment for some of these people. I mean, so my question is twofold. How, and I suppose this is a government relations question, but the questions are, how do you convince a government right now that this is something that demands urgent attention, given everything that's going on? And then the specific part of that is there a way to ask them to focus on specific things? I mean, Fernando, you mentioned billboards, for example. It's an interesting idea. But I mean, is there anything else in the toolkit, Angélica and Maurício, that you think would be effective at a time when, budgets are stretched and priorities are in strong competition?
Well, I can give you my perspective on that. So I think I have kind of a complicated answer to this, because I do think that, of course, illicit trade has to be a priority. I mean, that's not, and it has to be a priority because it can have security implications and can have real implications in the lives of people in many areas in Latin America. And that's the reason. If you ask me, I think the illicit trade per se, of course, I mean, it is the source of many problems. So it has to be a a priority, but it has to be a priority not because of the illicit trade per se, but because the illicit trade comes with all these implications. And kind of going back and with something that you just mentioned, which is that in many cases, the illicit trade is what sustains the livelihoods of many people. So yeah, we have the sophisticated criminal groups, but we also have a layer of people who just depend on these economies because there are no other alternatives. So my perspective on this is that if we just focus on the illicit trade for the illicit trade per se, we can just repeat in a cycle that has been repeated for decades in the region, and it hasn't really improved the situation, because we cannot really think about combating illicit trade unless we think about how it is connected with the things that we have talked about throughout this presentation, right? Like about socioeconomic inequalities, and if we don't think about police involvement, police corruption, problems of policing. So I think there are two layers here. How do you convince governments that this is important? Well, because this has serious security implications in different places, but the focus on this cannot just be a short-term focus on let's get rid of the trade, because any effort to just let's get rid of the trade has led to more problems, and that's kind of one of the lessons we have. Any effort that is just about like let's go and take away all the guys who are smuggling, or let's take all the trades who are trafficking drugs, like somebody else comes in and takes that place, right? Because this is the result of wider socioeconomic and political issues. So I think there is a two-pronged, and I'll stop with this. There is a two-pronged strategy that has to happen here. I think there has to be an intelligence-based policing response that is short-term, right? So there are things that governments are not prepared to deal with in Latin America that they have to become very prepared at dealing with, and that has to do with the e-commerce, the scams, all the cybercrime that really the region and the police forces in the region are not prepared for that. And there has to be a preventive effort before that gets out of control. And it may be already getting out of control. And then there is, again, like the long-term perspective that has to do with everything else. That has to do with combating corruption, that has to do with dismantling networks of illicit trade that are not just about the bad criminal actors, but are also about the politicians and police forces that sometimes support them. And also, of course, the wider socioeconomic story of ultimately, in regions where there is no other options, what are you going to bring to the population so that the illicit trade is not the avenue that they have, basically. So yes, I think there is a short term and a long term. Again, how do you convince governments, for example, to pay attention to cybercrime right now is because if they don't, they're going to have a much bigger problem in the future, right? And I think in some cases, the situation of security is so bad related with illicit trade that they have to. I don't think that they cannot just really turn a blind eye on many things. But yeah, that's that.
Thank you. Maurício?
Yes, I wanna join this conversation and based on what Fernando mentioned. And I think that communicating is one of the main aspects of this how to convince not only the government, but as well as people. And I think that the role of the media is very important in this aspect because, for example, take the example of Brazil. I talking to some friends and about the situation of the country and also following the situation of the country, I could identify that the media is much more concentrated in the spread of the virus and this kind of a consequence of on economic, but the media does not address. When I say media, is this popular media, the main TV broadcast, the main newspaper that people get information through, and they do not focus, for example, on this dynamic of how illicit trade impacted their daily lives. And I think that this is one very important point that must be covered by the media. And I think that this is the audience that must get the information and make and have their own decisions and not to buy what comes from the illicit market. And I think that this is one first level to stop this dynamic. And as at the same time, to show, for example, the economic impact of the illicit trade and how, for example, how much governments do not receive from tax collection. And for example, how much from this tax collection could be, for example, allocated to health system and to quality in education. And I think that showing this impact is a way of convincing make people push governments to change their behavior on providing law enforcement. And I think that we must first convince the base, and the base is the community, is the grassroots. And I think that this is a kind of a level of consciousness that we must achieve in a first glance.
Fernando, before we move on to the next question, I just wanted to give you a chance to react or reply to anything that's been said.
That's absolutely the case, Maurício. It's all these collections and the adverse effect of illicit trade, it's and the effect on tax collections, the economy, etc., is something very, very, that's always on the table, and that's always the temptation to find easy solutions for that. No, you should do that. The government should review taxation policies. The government should review this, review that. Let's increase taxes on the sector. Let's increase taxes on cigarettes. Let's do this. Let's do different stuff to try to curb illicit trade, or to try to find different solutions. And actually, when you see the situation that we have with some, let's say, positive, if we can say, Brian, examples on the consequences of the controls imposed by the COVID and by the pandemic in some countries, in some sectors of the economy, you're going to see we can see some sectors, benefiting from the controls and the response to the pandemic in terms of better and stricter enforcement from the authorities, and also from the borders, of the control of the borders, even if it's a forced or if an indirect control of the borders. You see in many sectors, I'm referring to our sector in Brazil and in other countries, just like in the region, in the Americas, Canada, but you have other examples in the world, just like Israel. The fact that the borders are being more controlled has resulted in the reduction of the illicit trade in our sector in Brazil, which is, regardless of the product, is a favorable aspect. There has been a record number of seizures in the product versus last year, which increased more than 800%. The tax collections of the sector increased from one year to the other more than 8%. And the number of jobs in the sector, even in the context of all the pandemic, is estimated to have increased more than 5%. So I think that this is some jumping a little bit in what we can learn and what we can, take as a positive example of the consequences of the other side of the pandemic, etc. I think that these examples can be introduced and can be learned. I mean, regardless of where it came from, the capability of enforcement, it's something that can always be considered as a strong way to counter the illicit trade.
Well, thank you for that,
Right.
Fernando. And yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say something very briefly. I mean, I agree with everything what has been said, and I know there is a big impact of tax collection, especially of piracy and smuggling and all those things. I will say though that it's and we, if I understood correctly, my colleagues and my fellow panelists, like this emphasis also in kind of changing a culture, especially in like borderland regions around these things. And I will say I partially agree with that, but I also think it's very complicated to invite populations to respect or not to engage in smuggling when you have that's basically the easiest way where they can access certain goods. But also when we see at the higher level these corruption scandals, when you see high-level government officials and schemes that are about avoiding tax collection at a much larger scale. So I think that I think about these issues holistically and the combat of illicit trade. And I think it's very hard to combat illicit trade unless there is also this parallel effort on combating those forms of illicit trade that are not happening through the biggest and very dangerous, of course, criminal organizations in the region, but there are corruption schemes that are happening and that engage. So think about how many scandals we had in the past year of Latin America, where it's actually members of the private sector and the state engaged in schemes that were about gouging prices or using substandard medical supplies. And yeah, like there are criminal groups engaged in that, but there are also schemes that are happening without the engagement of like quote unquote criminal groups, and still having these implications that we're talking about. So I think when we talk about illicit trade, we have to consider also those forms that I think tend to end up having not having the same level of attention just because they are not being embodied in like larger scale criminal groups.
Yeah, and I mean you're getting to rule of law issues generally, which I think are central to this debate. I want to invite those of you who are joining us on WebEx to send us any questions that you might have using the chat function. And I want to go ahead. I want to talk about sort of positive examples beyond just the effects of COVID, but we can save that for the end of the panel. In the meantime, I want to get to some of these questions. One that came in, it says, tell us about the legal penalties in your countries for those who make business with drugs and other medical needs. I assume that means on the illicit front. This raises sort of a broader philosophical question, perhaps about whether the path to crack down lies in strengthening the laws or whether it's just a question of enforcing the laws that already exist.
I can
Maurício, do you want to?
I'm sorry.
Maurício, do you want to go first?
Please, Angélica, please go.
Okay, Angélica, over to you.
I will just say something very briefly about that first question about legal penalties. If you look at Latin America as a whole, the penalties for drug trafficking are high, and they are higher than for other serious crimes. That tendency has been reduced to some extent, and there have been ups and downs. But the tendency of the past 40 years has been a tendency to increase penalties for drug trafficking and penalties related to the drug trade specifically. If you think about the balance between drug penalties, drug-related penalties, and other offenses, serious offenses, sometimes they are much higher for drug trafficking. So I don't think the problem is really the penalties as it is the enforcement.
But just to jump in, I'm not sure this is about narcotics per se. I actually took this as a question about pharmaceuticals. I may be misreading it, but we're talking about counterfeit and sort of illicit pharmaceuticals. And I guess the broader philosophical question of whether more tougher punishments are needed, or whether it's just a question of enforcing the laws that are already on the books.
So just in connection to what I just said, I will say that I cannot speak really about the penalties for this because I don't know much about those. But I will just say in general, just increasing penalties, it doesn't really work, because what we see is a number of examples of that, unless the emphasis has to be first on the operation of the justice system, impunity, actually enforcing penalties, enforcing proportionately rather than just increase them.
If you allow me, no, sorry, Maurício, go ahead, please.
No, it's a very brief comment. I would say that I agree with Angélica and saying that also this law enforcement and the rule of law, all these issues must be combined with could be a fight against the culture of impunity. And I think that this is what becomes more precedent for having a perpetuation of this crime.
Fernando.
No, I would just to reinforce the comment that I just made, that it's been in our sector, it's been very clear the idea that a deeper enforcement is something that is bringing actual much more results than reinforcement of the laws, because I agree absolutely with Angélica that in general laws are already strong. They can be improved, especially when you say when you talk about contraband in most of the countries. Yes, but you can see really interesting results when you see the indirect responses that you got from the closing of the borders, especially with Brazil and Paraguay and many other the other border countries here, where you have an immense flow of counterfeited, of contraband, of cigarettes, etc. You have seen an unprecedented, reduction of the illicit volumes that flows in Brazil. We have seen higher costs of the illicit trade, which resulted in higher prices of the illicit product in Brazil, which lowered their volume and gave opportunity to the legal domestic industry to replace part of the product. So I think that it was a clear example where, without any interference in terms of taxation policies and other measures, rather than direct or indirect enforcement, and also the difficulties of distribution, logistics, etc., a clear example where the enforcement demonstrated to play an important role in the equation.
So we've done a diagnosis of the problem. We've also talked about what governments and other authorities, and as well as the private sector, should do. And Fernando, you've spoken about how, one of the collateral effects of the last 13 months with border closures and elsewhere has helped in some cases in a reduction in some of this illicit trade in some areas. But of course, I'm sure we'd all agree, and we all know that that's not going to last forever. My question is to kind of look at best practices and specific examples in recent years where, countries, either local governments or national governments, have actually made a meaningful dent in some of this illicit trade. I mean, is there anybody who you look at around the region recently who you can kind of point to and say, yeah, you know what, they actually did a good job taking this seriously, and whether it was against illicit trade in general or against a specific segment, and what can we learn from those specific examples? Anyone? Angélica, I see you.
I didn't want to go first again, but I hate to be this person all the time, but the reality is that I think it's very difficult to reduce the illicit trade. So we may have, in some ways, I don't think we can have like the example of a place where illicit trade has been, or we do have examples, but generally those examples have many caveats, right? Either because the illicit flows move somewhere or mutate, or because the illicit trade per se can adapt pretty well. I think we have examples of small initiatives that can help reduce the trade, but also reduce the most complicated security impacts and social impacts of illicit trades. And we have some, I do think we have some examples. I'd like to talk recently a lot about how in a place like Guatemala recently, where there was not, I don't think anybody ever thought that you can really fight the illicit networks that control the state. There was some progress done when CICIG was in place, the Commission Against Impunity, and that the dismantling of some of those networks of connection between organized crime and high-level political authorities, they started to be dismantled. And I think that had some impact in Guatemala in reducing, at least at some level, the flows of organized crime, but also like the most open security impacts. Now there have been recent setbacks, but I think that was an experience of how you tackle what I think is the most complicated aspect in a core cornerstone of organized crime, which is that connection between politics and organized crime. Of course, I think we also have smaller, like good experiences. The case in Medellin, Colombia, of course, has caveats, but it's also a place where through the connection between the state and public-private partnerships, at least some of the consequences of illicit trades have been reduced, especially in terms of homicide. Now, with very complicated story about basically organized crime is persisting and illicit trade still persists. So again, I think it's very hard to find a situation where you will say illicit trade was completely reduced, but we do have stories of success in reducing the worst consequences, or at least like kind of mitigating the impact. And I think when you think about Colombia right now and like the debates regarding drug trafficking and what to do with illicit crops, for example, we do have evidence that the best thing and the one thing that tends to have a more long-term impact in the flows or in the cultivation of coca, for example, is not fumigation or just forced eradication, but other forms of the manual and voluntary eradication that is partnered with alternative development projects. So I think we have some evidence of things that may work. Some things work in the short term and seem to work in the short term, but they don't necessarily work in the long run.
May I add just one comment to what Angélica said? That I think, for example, when I think of, for example, examples and also what could be best practices, and I think that our analysis on best practices and examples come only after all these pandemic has an end, and I put with in brackets, because I think that when we achieve a certain level of control of this pandemic, but I think that best practices and examples could be also taken from what governments and also institutions are doing in a preventive manner. And I think that prevention is also one good example of avoiding the high level of tendency of illicit trade. And I think that, for example, in December last year, I guess Interpol issued a global alert for the threat of vaccinations, warning its member countries to prepare to organize crime networks targeting COVID-19 vaccines. So that was the alert. And I think that when some institutions have this kind of a preventive role, in a sense that provide information sharing to governments and provide intelligence strategies to combat these practices, I think that this is one aspect that we could also take for granted for combating illicit trade during this pandemic period.
Fernando, do you have anything to add on this one?
I just want to reinforce, from the perspective of the private sector and in line with what I just mentioned, Brian, I think that reinforcing the importance of the public and private partnerships. And I think that one of the good examples that I couldn't avoid to mention is the example of the partnership that we've been doing with the Minister of Justice and University of São Paulo, University of Mackenzie, Mackenzie University here in Brazil, with the triple border, with the training of agents from Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina, with more than 2,500 agents already being trained, sharing intelligence, reducing the asymmetries between the corporate and increasing the cooperation between countries. I think that those types of initiatives are something that we can, from the perspective of the private sectors, are welcome, and are things that I think that can. And we're willing to contribute and to play our role in this equation. That's basically how we think that things can be evolving each time more.
Yeah, and building on that, and also drawing from some of the questions that have just come in. Several people are pointing out that, as you just did, that illicit trade tends to cross borders. And that there has to be a private and public alliance, But you also, it has to be multiple governments involved in kind of coordinating and looking at the same problem, whether it's in the Triple Frontera area of Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil, or in places like, help me out here, the Ecuador-Colombia border, which is also, kind of a problem area. Obviously, any kind of along the Venezuela-Colombia border is very difficult. But there are some cases where it's more possible. Are there any international bodies that are particularly good for these kinds of conversations? I mean, for member companies, for people here today in charge of this issue for their specific company, or beyond just kind of the one-to-one conversations that can happen with national governments, is there an international body like, say, a Mercosur that has proven especially effective in terms of looking at this, or do they tend to be kind of with individual governments, these conversations?
So I think there is an opportunity with, I think police across the region, police forces have a significant amount of communication. And there is training that happens across countries. And I don't think, my sense is that that's a way to improve collaboration and intelligence sharing that's probably can be further developed. And there are bodies, the name is escaping me, I think it's the America's police. Like, there are some bodies that are cross countries and where you have representatives of different police forces, where I think there is an opportunity there. I think we really, collaboration across countries is essential. I think we tend to maybe misunderstand or think in the wrong way about what collaboration should mean. I think a lot of it happens in terms of training. I think there is less of this prospective sharing of, okay, we know. I think that some of the movements that happen in the region can be at some level, if not predicted, at least foreseen to some level. And I don't think it never happens, because a lot of the collaboration is reactive. We know this person has become a big threat. We know this group has become a big threat. And this is why, going back to the question that you posed a while ago, why it's important to convince or for countries to engage in this, is because when it's just we react, that's what we do most of the time. And reacting, it really doesn't provide an opportunity to really try and prevent things before they become a big issue. So I think this collaboration places that happen between police forces across the region can be a place where some of this collaboration can take place. But then beyond policing, there has to be, I think, more collaboration at other levels, more intelligence collaboration. But yeah, I think that I think police forces in the region are relatively well connected, and there can be more done in that area.
Maurício, you look like you have something to say. We have about a minute or so left. Can you do it in, say, 30 seconds or so?
Yes, thank you, Brian. But I think that one important movement that is happening now, and also that the University for Peace is leading a role in this discussion, is to disseminate what the Parliament for Latin American and Caribbean is doing with the bill to combat illicit trade and transnational organized crime. And I think that we are connecting these institutions, academicians and researchers, and also governments in the region in order to provide this perspective in enhancing national law and how to combat illicit trade. And I think that this is one aspect that we also can take for granted. Thank you.
Thank you. Fernando, any final comments just before we wrap up? 30 seconds or so?
No, I'd just like to thank you, Brian. And I mean, we as a company that is transforming our business mode, is going through a big transformation in direction to a smoke-free future. The illicit trade elimination is also fundamental part of our transformation. And it's key for us to be in that discussion and to be leading a discussion from the private sector side as well.
I'd like to thank our panelists, Fernando, Angélica, and Maurício. Thank you. This was a conversation just like we wanted. Lots of interesting insights. Thank you to our audience as well. Thank you to Philip Morris International again for sponsoring the conversation. And we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.